There's a photograph from 1955 that haunts me. It shows a small church in rural Ohio, so packed for Sunday service that people are literally standing outside the doors, straining to hear the sermon through open windows. Fast forward to 2024, and that same building is now a CrossFit gym. The transformation happened so quietly, so gradually, that most people didn't even notice when the stained glass was replaced with motivational posters about crushing your personal records. But here's what makes this story truly unsettling. It's not just one church, it's 20,000 of them across America. 20,000 sacred spaces converted into bars, nightclubs, climbing gyms, and luxury apartments in just the last 2 decades. And the real question nobody wants to ask is this: what happened so catastrophic, so fundamental that it could hollow out an institution that survived the Black Death, 2 world wars, and the entire Enlightenment, but couldn't survive the age of the smartphone? The numbers tell a story that reads like a horror novel for the faithful. In 1972, only 1 in 20 Americans claimed no religious affiliation. Today, it's nearly 1 in 3. Among Americans under 30, it's approaching 1 in 2. We're not talking about a gentle decline. We're talking about a civilizational shift happening at a pace that would have been unthinkable to our grandparents. In 2000, the typical American church had 137 regular attendees. By 2020, that number had dropped to 65. And here's the truly shocking part. Demographers project that by next Christians will no longer be the majority in America for the first time since the colonial era. But statistics don't capture the human dimension of what's happening. Let me tell you about Pastor Michael Thompson in rural Kentucky. For 30 years, he led a congregation of 200 families. By 2019, he was preaching to 17 people, most of them over 70. He told a reporter something that still gives me chills. "I used to worry about saving souls. Now I worry about who's going to carry my coffin when I die, because there won't be anyone left." 6 months later, his church closed its doors forever. He now works at a hardware store. This isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a pattern so vast that we're only beginning to understand its implications. And the explanations you've heard, the comfortable narratives about secularization and modernity, they're not wrong exactly, but they're missing something crucial, something that everyone can see but nobody wants to say out loud. Hey everyone, Professor Archive here. Before we go deeper into this phenomenon that's reshaping the very fabric of American society, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now, and what time is it there? Are you someone who still goes to church, used to go, or never went at all? Drop it in the comments because the geographical and personal patterns of what we're about to discuss are absolutely fascinating. And if you appreciate the research that goes into these deep dives into uncomfortable truths, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us keep investigating the stories that others won't touch. All right, let's continue. The official story goes like this. America is secularizing just like Europe did, just a few decades behind. Science replaced superstition, education replaced dogma, and rational people simply outgrew their need for ancient myths. It's a clean narrative. It's also incomplete. Because here's what that narrative can't explain. Why did it happen so fast? The Soviet Union spent 70 years actively trying to eradicate religion, using the full force of a totalitarian state, and within a decade of its collapse, churches were packed again. Yet in America, with no government persecution, no official atheism campaign, no systematic suppression, the collapse has been faster and more total than anything the Soviets achieved with gulags and show trials. The first crack in the facade appeared in 1962. That was the year the Supreme Court banned mandatory school prayer. But that's not when faith started dying. Church attendance actually increased throughout the 60s. No, the real turning point came later, and it came from an unexpected direction. In 1976, Jimmy Carter declared himself a born-again Christian and won the presidency. It seemed like a victory for American faith. Instead, it was the beginning of the end, because that election marked the moment when religion became explicitly, undeniably political. Within a decade, the moral majority had formed, turning evangelical Christianity into a voting bloc. By the time we reached the 1990s, if you walked into certain churches, you couldn't tell whether you were at a worship service or a Republican campaign rally. Here's a fact that should disturb everyone. In 1972, there was virtually no difference in church attendance rates between Democrats and Republicans. By 2020, Republicans were twice as likely to attend weekly services as Democrats. Religion didn't just become political, it became partisan. And here's the part no one wants to say that killed it. Because here's what happened. An entire generation of young Americans watched their faith communities abandon the teachings they claimed to hold sacred the moment it became politically inconvenient. They watched churches that preached about helping the poor fight against healthcare expansion. They watched religious leaders who claimed moral authority defend politicians who embodied everything their scriptures condemned. They watched the same people who quoted scripture about welcoming strangers campaign for closed borders and travel bans. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle, it was spectacular. And young people raised on the internet where contradictions can be screenshotted and shared instantly noticed. But let's go deeper, because the political explanation, while significant, still doesn't capture the full picture. There's something else happening, something that touches on the very nature of belief in the modern age. In 2008, a sociologist named Robert Putnam published research that should have been front-page news but was largely ignored. He found that the single biggest predictor of religious affiliation wasn't your beliefs about God, the afterlife, or the supernatural. It was whether your friends went to church. Faith, it turned out, was primarily social, not spiritual. This explains something crucial: why the decline accelerated so dramatically after 2007. That was the year the iPhone was released. That was the year Facebook opened to the general public. That was the moment when human social life fundamentally restructured itself around digital networks rather than physical communities. Think about what church actually provided for most of American history. It wasn't primarily theological certainty, it was community. It was a place where you met your spouse, where business connections were made, where your children found friends, where you got news, shared meals, found help when you needed it. It was the social infrastructure of American life. But then, suddenly, you didn't need church for any of that. You could meet romantic partners on apps, network professionally on LinkedIn, get news from Twitter, build communities on Reddit, find support groups on Facebook. Every single function that religion served, except the explicitly spiritual one, could now be fulfilled more efficiently by technology. And here's the brutal truth that nobody wants to acknowledge. For most people throughout history, the explicitly spiritual component wasn't actually the primary draw. Prayer, contemplation, connection with the divine, these were real, but they were the bonus features, not the main product. The main product was community, and once that could be obtained elsewhere, the rest crumbled. There's a chart that tells this story with devastating clarity. It tracks 3 trends from 1990 to 2020: religious affiliation, participation in community organizations like the Rotary Club or Elks Lodge, and social media adoption. The first 2 are nearly identical declining curves. The third is an ascending line that rises as the others fall. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's close enough to be deeply unsettling. But we're still not at the deepest level, because even this doesn't explain why the collapse has been so complete, so total, so irrevocable. After all, people have had social alternatives before. Industrialization gave us labor unions and professional associations. Television gave us entertainment at home, but through all of that, churches survived. So what's different now? The answer is information. And it's here that we arrive at the truth that absolutely no one in a position of authority wants to acknowledge. For most of human history, religious beliefs were protected by information scarcity. If you grew up in a small town in rural America in 1950, your understanding of the world was shaped by 3 sources: your parents, your school, and your church. All 3 generally told you the same story about how the world worked, what was true and what was good. If you had doubts, where would you even go to explore them? The local library maybe, but that required knowing what questions to ask. And questioning your faith openly meant social ostracism from the only community you knew. So most people didn't. They inherited their parents' religion, taught it to their children, and the cycle continued. Then came the internet, and suddenly, any question you had about your faith, no matter how obscure or troubling, could be answered instantly. Want to know about contradictions in biblical texts? One search away. Curious about other religions' claims? 5 minutes of reading. Wondering if other people share your doubts? There's a forum for that with thousands of members. And here's what people found when they started looking. The foundations were shakier than they'd been told. Much shakier. Let me give you a specific example because this is where we need to be precise. The Noah's Ark story. For centuries, American Christians were taught this as literal truth. A global flood, two of every animal, the whole thing. Questioning it meant questioning your faith entirely, and since there was no easy way to investigate the claim, most people simply accepted it. But today, a curious teenager with a smartphone can spend 10 minutes learning that a wooden boat the size described in Genesis would collapse under its own weight before it could be completed. That housing and feeding millions of species for 40 days is logistically impossible, that there's no geological evidence for a global flood in the proposed timeframe, and that the story appears to be borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian flood myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, you might say, but sophisticated believers don't take it literally. They understand it as metaphor. And you'd be right. But here's the problem. For generations, millions of Americans were taught it as literal, undeniable truth. And when they discover they were misled about this, a terrible question arises. What else were they misled about? The doubt spreads like a crack in a windshield. If the creation story isn't literal, what about the resurrection? If the resurrection happened differently than described, what about the divinity of Jesus? If that's uncertain, why this religion instead of others? And suddenly the entire edifice is wobbling. This process is called deconversion, and the internet is full of testimonies from people who've gone through it. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Start with one small question, usually about a specific biblical claim or historical inconsistency. Research it honestly. Find that the apologetic answers don't hold up under scrutiny. Realize that church leaders either don't know about these problems or have been deliberately obscuring them. Feel betrayed. Start questioning everything. Discover that life without belief is not only possible, but for many more intellectually honest and emotionally healthy. Leave the faith entirely. 20 years ago, this process might happen to one person in 1,000, and they'd go through it alone, convinced something was wrong with them. Today, it's happening to one person in 3, and they're sharing their experiences online, creating a cascading effect where each deconversion story makes the next one easier. But here's where the story takes a truly dark turn, and it's something that church leaders absolutely understand, but will never say publicly. They cannot engage with these critiques honestly without destroying their own institutions. Think about it from a pastor's perspective. A young member comes to you with doubts about biblical inerrancy, pointing to specific contradictions they found online. You have 2 options. Option 1, acknowledge that yes, there are contradictions. The texts were written by humans across centuries with different agendas. Translation is imperfect, and many stories are metaphorical rather than historical. This is intellectually honest, but it demolishes the authority of Scripture. If the Bible is fallible on this point, why trust it on any point? Option 2, insist on literal inerrancy despite the obvious problems, rely on increasingly convoluted apologetics, and hope the person stops asking questions. This preserves biblical authority in theory but relies on the questioner's willingness to suspend critical thinking. And here's the thing. People raised in the age of information don't easily suspend critical thinking. They've been trained since childhood to fact-check, cross-reference, and verify sources. So the pastor is trapped. Honesty leads to the church's dissolution. Dishonesty leads to the questioner leaving anyway. But now they leave angry, feeling they've been lied to. And increasingly, churches are choosing option 2, which is why the exodus is accelerating rather than stabilizing. There's a leaked document from 2019, an internal Southern Baptist Convention memo, that's absolutely chilling in its honesty. It acknowledged that the denomination was losing members at an unsustainable rate, particularly among the young and educated. But here's the crucial part. It identified the cause as increased access to alternative viewpoints and critical scholarship, and its solution was not to address the theological problems being raised, but to encourage members to limit their internet use and stick to approved resources. Think about what that represents. The second largest Christian denomination in America responded to intellectual challenges not by defending its positions in open debate, but by essentially recommending ignorance. And they wonder why people are leaving. But the story gets even more complex, because the decline isn't affecting all groups equally, and the pattern of who's leaving and who's staying reveals something profound about what's really happening. Here's a fact that shocked me when I first encountered it. While mainline Protestant churches are collapsing, losing up to 70% of their membership in some cases, certain fundamentalist churches are actually growing. Not massively, but growing nonetheless. The churches that are dying fastest are the moderate ones, the ones that tried to accommodate modernity, that ordained women, accepted evolution, embraced social justice. The ones holding on are the ones that refused to compromise, that insisted on biblical literalism, traditional gender roles, and separation from secular culture. At first, this seems paradoxical. Wouldn't the more moderate, flexible churches be better positioned to survive? But the pattern makes sense when you understand what's actually happening. Religion in America is polarizing, just like everything else. For people with serious doubts about supernatural claims, a moderate church offers nothing that secular institutions don't provide better. Why wake up early on Sunday for watered-down theology and vague spiritual platitudes when you could sleep in, then spend that time with friends or pursuing hobbies? Moderate religion tries to have it both ways, keeping the label Christian while abandoning most of the distinctive truth claims. But without those truth claims, there's no compelling reason to show up. Fundamentalist churches, on the other hand, offer something genuinely different: absolute certainty. In a world of information overload, conflicting claims, and endless options, they provide clear answers. They tell you exactly what's true, what's good, what to do, who to marry, how to live. For people psychologically predisposed toward that kind of structure, it's incredibly appealing. The trade-off is that you have to accept increasingly implausible claims and isolate yourself from contradictory information, but for some, that trade-off is worth it. So, American religion is bifurcating. The middle is vanishing. You're either all in, accepting the whole package and filtering out contradictory information, or you're out entirely. And the data shows that the out entirely category is winning by a massive margin. But there's another dimension to this that we need to address, because it explains why this is happening in America specifically, or at least more dramatically in America than elsewhere. American Christianity was always different from European Christianity. In Europe, faith was often a matter of cultural inheritance, tied to national identity, sometimes legally established. It could be lukewarm, nominal, a background assumption more than an active commitment. When secularization came to Europe, it was like switching from one cultural mode to another. American Christianity, by contrast, has always been intense, voluntaristic, revivalist. From the Great Awakenings through modern evangelicalism, American faith emphasized personal conversion experiences, emotional intensity, absolute commitment. It was never meant to be lukewarm. You were either saved or damned, committed or lost, in or out. This intensity was a source of strength when America was expanding, conquering frontiers, building a new civilization. That kind of energy thrives on challenges and certainty, but it's incredibly fragile when confronted with ambiguity and doubt. European-style faith could soften, could become cultural Christianity, could survive as a gentle background presence. American faith, built on intensity and certainty, tends to collapse completely when the certainty goes. And the certainty is gone. That's the part that no one wants to say clearly. It's gone not because of some moral failing, not because Americans are less virtuous than their grandparents, but because we live in an information environment where absolute certainty about ancient supernatural claims is no longer tenable for most thinking people. Let me be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not claiming that religious experiences aren't real or that faith doesn't provide genuine value to many people. I'm not arguing that science has disproven God or that atheism is correct. What I'm saying is this: the specific form that American Christianity took, built on biblical literalism, absolute certainty, and social conformity, cannot survive in an age of information abundance and social fragmentation. And rather than adapting, most institutions are doubling down on the very elements that make them unviable. Here's a statistic that illustrates this perfectly. In 1990, 42% of Americans believed the Bible was the literal Word of God. By 2017, that had dropped to 24%. That's not a gentle decline, that's a collapse. And here's the kicker. Among the remaining believers, the percentage insisting on literal inerrancy has actually increased. The middle position, that the Bible is inspired but not necessarily literal in every detail, is vanishing. People are choosing between every word is literally true and its ancient mythology, and increasingly they're choosing the latter. There's a conversation I had with a former megachurch pastor that still haunts me. He'd left the ministry after 30 years, burned out and disillusioned. I asked him when he knew it was over, when he knew the old model was dying. He said, "When I realized I was spending more time explaining why the Bible wasn't wrong than explaining what it taught. When apologetics became 90% of the job, I knew we'd lost." Because that's what's happened. Modern American Christianity has become primarily defensive, focused on explaining away problems rather than presenting compelling truths. Every sermon has to include disclaimers. Every Bible study has to address contradictions. Every youth group leader has to be prepared to debunk internet atheists. The whole enterprise has become reactive, besieged. And here's the truly tragic part. The things that made American Christianity powerful, the emphasis on personal transformation, community support, meaning and purpose, these are still needed. People are still hungry for transcendence, still seeking communities of deep commitment, still wanting their lives to mean something beyond consumption and entertainment. The need hasn't vanished, but the institution built to meet that need has so thoroughly compromised itself, so completely wedded itself to political power, intellectual dishonesty, and resistance to modernity that it can no longer fulfill its own purpose. The result is what sociologists call spiritual homelessness. 30% of Americans now claim no religious affiliation, but surveys show that most of them still believe in something, still consider themselves spiritual. They've left the institutions but not the hunger. And they're trying to fill it with everything from yoga and meditation to psychedelics and conspiracy theories, from political movements treated as quasi-religions to fandoms and online communities that function like churches. Some of this is healthy exploration. Much of it is deeply concerning. Because say what you want about traditional religion, but it had 2,000 years to work out relatively stable forms of community, meaning-making, and moral formation. We're now in a massive, uncontrolled experiment, with hundreds of millions of people trying to invent new forms of meaning from scratch, using whatever materials they find on the internet. And this brings us to the consequences, because the death of American faith isn't just a religious story, it's reshaping everything. Let's start with politics. For most of American history, religious institutions served as mediating structures between the individual and the state. They provided identity, community, and moral framework independent of political affiliation. When you were primarily a Methodist or a Catholic, your political identity was secondary. But as religious affiliation has declined, political identity has rushed in to fill the void. The data on this is stark. Americans now are more likely to say their political party is extremely important to their identity than they are to say that about their religion. We don't just have political opinions anymore. We have political identities that function exactly like religious identities, complete with sacred texts, that's the Constitution or various political manifestos, heretics, that's the other side, blasphemies, that's certain ideas that cannot be questioned, and apocalyptic thinking, the belief that if the other side wins, everything is lost. This explains the insanity of modern American politics better than any other factor. When politics becomes religion, compromise becomes heresy. You can negotiate with political opponents. You cannot compromise with evil. And increasingly, that's how we see each other. Not as fellow citizens with different policy preferences, but as existential threats to everything good. Then there's the social fabric itself. Robert Putnam's research on social capital, the networks of relationships that make communities function, shows a catastrophic decline. Americans have fewer close friends, participate in fewer community organizations, trust their neighbors less, feel more isolated. And the decline maps almost perfectly onto the decline in religious participation. This isn't because religion is magic, it's because for better or worse, churches were the primary mechanism through which Americans built community. When you went to church, you didn't just worship, you organized bake sales and volunteered at food banks. You checked on elderly members and helped new families move in. You created dense networks of mutual obligation and support. And when church attendance collapsed, all of that went too. The mental health crisis we're experiencing, particularly among young people, is directly connected to this. Humans are social animals. We need regular face-to-face interaction, stable communities, shared meaning. We need to feel part of something larger than ourselves. For most of history, religion provided that. Now it doesn't, and we haven't built anything to replace it. Depression rates among teenagers have doubled since 2010. Suicide rates are up 30%. Loneliness has reached epidemic levels, with more than half of Americans reporting that they feel persistently alone. These aren't just statistics. They're symptoms of a civilization that destroyed its primary community-building institution faster than it could build alternatives. And then there's the question of meaning itself. Here's something that psychologists have known for decades, but we've collectively forgotten. Humans don't just need to be happy. We need to believe our lives mean something. We need narrative, purpose, connection to something transcendent. Religion provided that, for all its flaws. It told you why you existed, what you were supposed to do, how your individual life fit into a cosmic story. When you're told you're a beloved child of God, created with purpose, destined for eternity, that's a powerful foundation for building a life, even if it's not literally true. But what's the secular alternative? The honest materialist answer is that you're a temporary arrangement of atoms, the accidental product of billions of years of purposeless evolution, living briefly on a tiny rock, orbiting an average star in an incomprehensibly vast universe that doesn't know or care that you exist, destined for complete annihilation with no ultimate significance whatsoever. Now live your best life. That's not a recipe for meaning. It's a recipe for existential despair. And we're seeing that despair everywhere, dressed up in different forms but fundamentally the same. The sense that nothing matters, that we're just killing time until we die, that any meaning we claim to find is a comforting delusion we tell ourselves to get through the day. I want to be clear. I'm not arguing that we should believe comforting lies. If something isn't true, we shouldn't believe it just because the truth is hard. But we also need to be honest about what we've lost and what we haven't yet built to replace it. The death of American faith is revealing something we'd rather not acknowledge. We don't actually know how to build a functioning civilization without some kind of sacred story binding it together. Every successful society in human history has had one, a shared narrative about who they are, why they exist, what they're supposed to do. For America, that story was always intertwined with Christianity, however imperfectly. Now that story is dying, and we haven't written a new one. Instead, we have fragments, conflicting narratives, competing visions, none of them commanding anything close to universal assent. And a civilization running on fragments is a civilization in crisis. So where does this go? What happens next? Because the trend shows no signs of reversing. If anything, it's accelerating.